and welcome to the show, where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today on the show, we have Netana Markovitz. She's a medical student, and she wrote the Kevin MD article, 13 Tips for Medical Students Starting Their Clinical Rotations. Netana, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we'll get into your article in a little bit, but first off, can you share your story and your journey to where you are today?
Absolutely. So I'm originally from a small town outside of Boston, Lexington. I attended Columbia University in New York City for college. There I majored in English, and I also fulfilled all the pre-med requirements. I spent the year following graduation working as a research coordinator in a group called the Cancer Outcomes Research and Education Program at Mass General, and that year I also applied to medical school, and I was accepted to the University of Michigan, where I'm currently a third-year student. So just to provide a little bit of context, I think it'll help explain sort of my article. So Michigan does not follow the traditional 2-year preclinical curriculum. We actually have a 1-year preclinical followed by our core clinical rotation. So I actually finished up my clinical rotations in October and then had my dedicated step 1 period, and then actually took step 1 a couple weeks ago. So I'm really excited to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Fantastic. And just in general, during the pandemic, how has your clinical rotations and how has the medical experience been?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So for me, really the pandemic really came in full force in the middle of my clinical rotation. So I was actually in the middle of my pediatrics rotation. So after the AAMC issued a statement recommending that medical student rotations were paused, I was actually home from mid-March through June. And then we resumed our clinical rotations in June, and Michigan did a really great job of making sure we weren't too much affected. So they shortened sort of the remaining rotations, and we ended up only ending our year a few weeks later than expected. Things are kind of resuming as normal, or as normal as possible.
What's something that you've learned during the pandemic that you wish you knew back before everything started?
It really gave me a chance to pause and reflect, and you know, your core clinical rotations are sort of go. When you're not in the hospital, you're home studying, and having a few months in the middle of that year to really take some time to think about wellness, and really taking time for yourself. I think I went back in June a lot, really refreshed, and really prioritizing sort of my own mental and physical health, in addition to my learning.
All right. So that transition between preclinical and clinical is obviously a huge shift for every medical student. And you offer a few tips in your Kevin MD article. In fact, 13 of them, 13 tips for medical students starting their clinical rotations. Now, for those who haven't read the article, can you just walk my audience through it and maybe share the story of why you decided to write it?
Definitely. So I really wanted to write the article because I think myself and talking to many of my friends, it's a really isolating year. It can be a really wonderful year, but it's also really tough. You take a lot of really high achieving perfectionist students, used to sort of like studying for that test and getting that good grade, and put them in an environment of constant evaluation. And as I mentioned, when they're not being evaluated, they're at home studying for what feels like an extremely high pressured exam. It's a totally new environment. You're not seeing your friends in the library like you were in your clinical years. And I really wanted to normalize some of the thoughts that I had going through the year and really encourage others to do the same. I think that I got a lot from talking to older students and sort of that institutional knowledge, and I wanted to pass that down. So in my article, I sort of talk about some tips. For example, my first bullet point talks about sort of normalizing the subjectivity of the evaluation system. You know, when you take sort of a group of students and have them being evaluated like humans evaluating other humans, I think it's sort of self-explanatory that there's going to be some element of subjectivity. However, seeing those numbers, for example, at my institution, Michigan, we're evaluated on like a 0 to 9 number point scale, and that number can feel like it's the end of the world, end all be all. And I really kind of thought, because sometimes I felt like I was performing very similarly and getting like drastically different number grades, and just think taking a step back and saying, okay, maybe one person's really like 9 is another person 6, really helped me. And I tried to do my best to really learn as much as I could from each evaluation, but not letting it define like my confidence. So that was sort of my first bullet point. I think another thing that was really important to me was the word confidence. I think people toss that around a lot, you know, as a clinical student and as a medical student, and just say like, be more confident, really work on your confidence. And I struggled with this, especially initially, because I would just be like so nervous for oral presentations and feel my voice shaking and just like berate myself for the rest of the day. Why wasn't I more confident? Why wasn't I more confident? And I think for me, taking a step back and thinking, well, really, there's no reason that I should be confident at this point in the year. I oftentimes know the least in the room. I'm presenting in front of a group of residents, of attendings who all know more than me. And it's really awesome that we have the opportunity to kind of learn and work on our skills and get the chance to do the oral presentations. However, I think I would like advise students who are either starting their rotations or in the midst of their rotations to just trust the process, know the confidence will come, and not get too hung up if you're not confident at the beginning or if you feel really, really scared. So I think another thing I talk about in the article is really listening to your body and letting yourself off the hook. There were nights when I got home and I was just like, all I want to do is lie in bed and watch Netflix and eat. And I'm sure a lot of people have felt that way. And at the beginning of the year, I was like, no, I have to do like X amount of UWorld, like I said. And oftentimes on those nights, I would just feel like I wouldn't be productive and I wouldn't get the rest that like my body was craving. And so towards the end of the year, I did a better job of like, if I came home and was just so exhausted, I would say, okay, I'm just going to go to sleep early, get a good night's sleep, and maybe like start again tomorrow. And I just want to assure everyone that those nights definitely did not make a difference in my scores. So I think that was a big learning point for me of like really listening to what I needed instead of the quote unquote like shoulds.
Sure.
So I think that was a big thing for me. I think another thing is just getting back to my point of evaluations. In bullet point 9, I talk about how sometimes you're going to work really, really hard and just feel like your grades don't match how hard you're working or how good you feel like you're performing. And I think that's a little bit self-explanatory, but I think the system really makes you start to believe that your grades are everything and really that they'll define how good or bad of a doctor you'll be. So I just tried to remind myself that like, what we were doing was really, really hard. Grades, of course, are important, but they're not everything. And just to accept the grade and kind of move on and not let them define your sense of self. And then a bullet point that actually means a lot to me was I talk about how much of a difference nice residents can make. I had this, I experienced this firsthand this year. Really, residents could make or break a rotation for me.
Sure.
And what I actually started doing was keeping a list of the things that I liked or disliked that residents did or didn't do. And I fully plan to reference that list in 2 years when I'm a medical student. I think I learned so much about how to be a good resident to medical students this core clinical year. And I would encourage others to keep this in mind too. And just think about the things you liked and disliked. And then lastly, I think one of the big points I make is doing a better job advocating for yourself. I think just to give a concrete example, teaching, for those who haven't done their clinical year yet, is a really big part of rotation. So oftentimes residents or attendings will take an hour or 2 out of their day to really teach the medical students, which is an awesome opportunity. But for example, at the beginning of the year, if a resident or attending said to me, okay, if you guys want to stick around for a few more hours, then we can do teaching at 5 p.m. Or if you guys would prefer, we can just do it tomorrow. At the beginning of the year, I would have been worried that had I said I'd prefer to do the teaching the next day, that it would have shown less enthusiasm or that they would like me less. And at the end of the year, I think I realized that those things were a lot less important and that I could advocate for myself while still showing enthusiasm. So just to I would probably have said, I'm really excited about the teaching, but I'd love to take the next few hours to study. Would it be all right if we did it the next day? And I think that realization that I didn't have to like sacrifice my sense of self and advocating myself to get good grades and to do a good job was a big kind of learning point for me.
So you talk about evaluation, and there are some medical schools that simply just have a pass-fail for their clinical rotations. Now, what are your thoughts about that approach?
You know, I think our medical school, Michigan, has pass fail for our preclinical year. And I thought there was a lot of value in that because it really encourages sort of that sense of collaboration
Mhm.
and really just learning for the sake of learning, which I think is really valuable. I know there's been a lot of talk in sort of the broader medical community of whether to switch to a pass fail system. I think, I learned a lot from grades, and I think, for residency purposes, I think grades are important, but I don't know. It's a hard question that I'm not sure I know the answer to.
And one of the things that you mentioned was a list of things that you liked about residents and interns that you yourself would follow when you got to that point. What are some characteristics that define a strong resident or intern as it relates to medical students?
Some of the things that I really loved, and I was really lucky to work with some really, really incredible residents. I think, first of all, just the simple fact of like acknowledging the medical students
Hmm.
and remembering them on like as crazy as it sounds, residents just get so busy, and so
Yeah.
it's so easy to just kind of forget about the students. But taking that extra minute to say, oh, like I'm going to do XYZ. Do you guys want to come with me? Or I'm going to do XYZ. I might not be back for a few hours. Maybe you guys can take that time to study. And just kind of integrating them into the team, I think makes a huge difference. Another thing is, I think a lot of medical students would echo this, is just letting medical students go when there's
Hmm.
nothing left for them to do. I think obviously there's huge value in being present and being at the hospital, but there's some times when there's just not a lot going on. And I think medical students obviously have this dual responsibility of studying not only for the clinical rotation, but also for the shelf. So there's also a lot of value in being home and just having that time to study. I think obviously like teaching is a huge component of being a good resident, but I think being mindful, kind of what I was alluding to
Hmm.
earlier, of like when the best time to teach is. So for example, one of my residents on internal medicine made sure to do her teaching on days when we already had to stay late, so
Hmm.
that we weren't like staying extra so that to do teaching. So that made a really big difference. One of my residents on my psychiatry rotation, she knew all the residents would be in like a class and I would be there by myself, so she thought to tell me a few days in advance, hey, on this one day, like don't come in until 11.
Sure.
um, and I think getting back to my first bullet point of just being like really aware of the medical students and being mindful that they're studying and doing clinical rotations. And then I think lastly, just complimenting your medical students and
Hmm.
encouraging them and noticing when they do a good job, and even if you have constructive feedback, taking the time to sit down with them and deliver that feedback and telling them what they've improved on is really, really helpful.
We're talking to Netana Markovitz. She is a medical student, and she wrote the Kevin MD article, 13 Tips for Medical Students Starting their Clinical Rotations. Netana, you wrote about tips medical students should do, but have you seen any red flags or traps that some of your medical student colleagues have fallen into when making that transition to the clinical rotations?
Yeah, I'm really fortunate to be surrounded by really, really wonderful colleagues and students. So I don't think I've really witnessed anything egregious like firsthand. But I think, getting back to the article, just people just stay true to yourself.
Hmm.
Don't be someone you're not. People will see through sort of like fakeness or competition or being super competitive. So just obviously like if you made it to medical school, you're probably really wonderful, and just trust that you can just be yourself, and that'll be kind of enough, is what I would say.
And my final question, what is your take-home message that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
Yeah, great question. So I would say have fun. It's a really, really tough year. Like acknowledge that, let yourself off the hook. Don't be afraid to advocate for yourselves and kind of trust the process and know that competency and confidence will come.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your time and insight. And thanks again for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. It was